So, it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who even knows me in the slightest that I love Twilight. I love all vampire media, but in particular, a big hyperfixation of mine slash special interest is Twilight. And what I didn't know was just how much Jane Eyre inspired Twilight. I know that growing up, one of Stephanie's favorite books, if not her favorite book, was Jane Eyre. Um, and in an interview, I believe in 2005, she was asked by a friend of hers who was conducting the interview, a fellow author. Um, my source for this is the Twilight Illustrated Companion. She mentioned her friend brought up the fact that Twilight is very similar to Jane Eyre. Stephanie was like, "Oh my gosh, I think you're totally right. That was one of my favorite books growing up, and I think it went to her subconscious." So she's admitted that there are definite comparisons to be had, but she claims that it was completely unintentional. And I do think that that's true. I don't think that the similarities were something that Stephanie intended to do. Not that I'm running defense for her. She's incorrect about a ton of things, but I don't think this was blatant plagiarizing or even inspiration necessarily. I think it was more of something that, just like any of our interests, they'll embed themselves into our subconscious and we'll, accidentally take inspiration from them constantly. So here's a condensed list of comparisons I made between the Jane Eyre and Twilight characters, just for fun. As I was reading Jane Eyre, I was noticing all these little things, and I thought you guys might enjoy this. So Jane Eyre and Bella Swan have a few similarities. I mean, obviously, they're both well-read. They love books. They're both quiet but headstrong. They have kind of different lines of thinking than the other people that they encounter in their lives. And they also believe that they have very average looks. Compared to the people around them, they probably do. This is probably a true fact. But they obviously have a certain beauty as they are sought after by more than one person. They also hear the Edward / Mr. Rochester figure, despite the fact that he is in a different part of the world. And in Bella's case, she hears Edward's voice, and then the film version, she hears Edward's voice and sees him in a sort of hallucination. And then Jane Eyre, she hears Mr. Rochester's voice call out to her. So it's the same exact thing happening in what I would call the New Moon portion of Jane Eyre, which would be volume 3 of Jane Eyre. And so just where that is supposed to occur, it occurs in Jane Eyre as it does in Twilight. So very, very similar things happening there. Mr. Edward Rochester and Edward Cullen, I mean, immediately just the names right there. Very, 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 very similar. Obviously, they both have the first name Edward. They also both have kind of distinguished last names. Edward Rochester is actually mentioned by Bella in Twilight. Like I mentioned, she likes books, she likes classic literature, and so Jane Eyre is a book that she has on her bookshelf, and one day when she's trying to distract herself, she pulls out all these books and she tries to read them, but she keeps getting reminded of Edward, and so one of the books that she tries to read is Jane Eyre, and then she is reminded of the fact that Mr. Rochester's first name is Edward. She's like, I really can't escape this man anywhere. So some similarities between Edward Rochester and Edward Cullen. They both come from a large amount of money, whereas the Bella / Jane Eyre character does not. They always say that they're dangerous, but they don't show any real evidence for it. They're always just going on and on about, like, you shouldn't be with me, I'm dangerous. And yet we don't really actually see them do anything that would lead us to believe that they are as dangerous as they seem to be, or rather, they want to do these nefarious, dangerous tasks. However, their presence bring the other person into danger. Edward, being with Bella, attracts the attention of other vampires who end up trying to hurt her, and Mr. Rochester brings Jane Eyre into his house, where his former wife, they're still technically married by law, but they're no longer together, who, he claims is insane, and from what we see, she does appear to be insane, tries to, light the house on fire multiple times, which is obviously dangerous for Jane. Mr. Rochester and Edward both feel that the protagonist, Jane or Bella, should stay away from them, but yet they can't bring themselves to be the one to leave. Edward does eventually leave in New Moon, but he's constantly, instead of just leaving himself, all throughout the beginning of Twilight and even the beginning of New Moon, he knows logically, like, oh, well, I'm not good for her, I should leave, just like Mr. Rochester keeps telling Jane, but they can't bring themselves to do it because they know how much they need the other person. And that is also the one sort of selfishness that they allow themselves. Edward's one selfish thing and Mr. Rochester's one selfish thing is being with Bella and Jane, despite the fact that they don't believe it is the best for them. They also both view the woman figure, Jane or Bella, as being their master, despite the fact that they have the power of physical power and monetary power over them. They still believe themselves to be kind of at the beck and call of the woman because they're so enchanted and in love with them. They both can't read their mind. Mr. Rochester has difficulty guessing what Jane is thinking. She's someone that he can't really parse out and understand, whereas Edward is the same with Bella, but in his case, he literally can't read her mind like he can with everyone else. They both ask the other person to marry them multiple times, and the female protagonist refuses them for societal reasons. So, both Edward and Mr. Rochester attempt to ask their love interest to marry them, but Jane refuses because of the fact that she is from a much lower position than him, and she doesn't think that it would even really be allowed by other people, and she would never fit into his world, whereas Bella says no because of her age, and she is worried that other people will think that she's pregnant or something, and so they're rushing into the shotgun wedding. Mr. Rochester and Edward insist on spending a lot of money on their love interest and gifts and such, and their love interest does not want that and refuses them. Something interesting about this spending money aspect, though, is that Mr. Rochester, he ends up losing his eyesight, and he gives up on this train of thought of trying to spend money on Jane, whereas in Twilight, Edward does eventually get his way, and when Bella becomes a member of the family and she agrees to marry him, she kind of begrudgingly accepts his gifts of a nice ring, an expensive car, etc., etc. Neither couple has a sexual relationship until marriage, kind of scandalously for the time of Jane Eyre. Mr. Rochester and Jane do make out like Bella and Edward, but there is no premarital sex. Mr. Rochester is older and has more experience, and Edward is technically older. Physically he's not, but he has lived a longer time than Bella by a lot, and he also has more world experience. And then this is a big comparison. This is found in like the New Moon section, aka the volume 3 of Jane Eyre. When Bella/Jane returns to them after being gone, both Edwards believe that they have died and gone to heaven. They refuse to believe at first that she is actually there, and not just a figment of their imagination, or they're not dead and in heaven. And so that was a big moment that stood out to me. And then finally, I'm sure I could make a ton of other character comparisons, but these were the big 3 that I thought were definitely big inspirations for Stephenie Meyer. So the last one is St. John, who represents Jacob Black. Both their names start with J, which is a small thing, but I think notable enough. So with St. John and Jacob, their families know Bella's family / Jane's family. So St. John is actually a distant relative of Jane, and Jacob is actually a distant relative of Bella too, by marriage. And their families know each other, and they have a kind of family-like relationship because of that fact. St. John and Jacob use their, quote, like moral superiority to kind of bend the female protagonist's will. St. John uses religion, and Jacob uses this kind of fact of like, these bloodsuckers and stuff, and trying to get the female protagonist to become more on their side because of their own beliefs. They also both implore kind of a lack of consent in terms of touch. So St. John and Jacob both kind of touch the female protagonist in a way that we are seen makes them uncomfortable, and they never really ask for consent. There's this implication that St. John will want to have sex with her if they are to be married, and Jane explicitly thinks and says that isn't something that she can really see herself doing. She sees him more as like a brother, and she does have a little bit of feelings for him, but her love for Mr. Rochester is a lot deeper. And Bella's in the same position where she can see some sort of romantic feelings for Jacob during New Moon, but ultimately her love for Edward kind of keeps those from blossoming into anything, and she really doesn't have that desire to, kiss him and touch him like she does with Edward. However, the relationship kind of make more sense. Jane and St. John are closer in like status. More people would like to see them be together, and their union would just be a bit more logical. They could also both get things out of it that the other wants, but it just really isn't that kind of love match. And it's the same thing with Bella and Jacob, where their families want it from them. It would be super easy. Bella wouldn't be in danger like she is with Edward. There's a lot of logical reasons for her to be with Jacob, but it just isn't what she wants and knows is right. The Jacob / St. John character also tries to get the female protagonist to choose him many times without taking no for an answer. So whereas Mr. Rochester and Edward ask the female protagonist to marry them multiple times, the Jacob / St. John character do a similar thing with her also asking them to marry them, but rather than refusing for societal reasons, it's actually the opposite, where they're refusing because they know that it's not actually what they want. So Jane and Bella refuse to marry the Edward character because of the fact that society would scorn them for it, but they refuse the St. John / Jacob character because it's not personally what they want. The St. John / Jacob character finally becomes angry with the female protagonist and distant when they finally realize the no will never turn into a yes. And they become almost like a stranger to them. Think of Bella and Jacob at the end of New Moon versus the middle, and also just Bella and Jacob at the end of the series, especially like Breaking Dawn Part 1 and the beginning of Breaking Dawn Part 2 versus how they were in New Moon. And it's the same thing with St. John and Jane Eyre, where there is a time where they are really good friends and they're very close, and then when he realizes that he's never going to get what he wants, they essentially become much closer to strangers than friends. So those were all the major comparisons I picked up on. Let me know if you guys noticed any more. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Bye.